Thanks for joining us today at Policy Options. I'm Les Perot, the editor-in-chief of Policy Options, which is the digital magazine of the Institute for Research on Public Policy. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I'm broadcasting to you today from the unceded Indigenous lands of the Ganyonghaga Nation. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations, so we acknowledge their place on these lands as well. For those of you who are longtime fans of Policy Options, I should perhaps introduce myself. I'm new to the place, following in the large footsteps of former editor Jennifer Ditchburn, who is now my boss and president and CEO of the IRPP. I come to Policy Options after 25 years in print journalism on the prairies and in Quebec. The last half of that time was with the Globe and Mail, covering Quebec and national politics, along with pretty much anything else that would happen in Quebec. But that's enough about me. Today we gather to discuss the state of our democracy as the 2021 election campaign reaches the end with the vote on Monday. Every election campaign is unique, of course, but this one will have a place in several history books. The backdrop for this election includes an era that was marked by former US President Donald Trump, who unleashed anti-democratic forces in the United States and emboldened them around the world. Of course, the most striking and recent example, the one nearest to us here at home, was the mob attack on the US Capitol on January 6th. Here at home in Canada, we've seen extreme right and anti-vaccination movements make common cause in recent months. Our leaders have canceled events and been attacked by gravel-throwing protesters. Just this week in Quebec, the National Assembly resumed sitting with much higher security. Some of those protesters, meanwhile, have taken to blocking access to hospitals and schools across the country. None of this is on the scale of the attempted insurrection at the US Capitol, but Canadians have a habit of saying nasty things don't happen here, quite often just before they do happen here. Joining me now to talk about the state of our democracy, Stephanie Carvin, an associate professor of international affairs at the Norman Paterson School at Carleton University. Stephanie is a national security expert. Thanks for joining us, Stephanie.
Thanks for having me here today.
Sanjay Ruparelia is an associate professor and Jarislowsky Democracy Chair at the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Ryerson University. Sanjay studies India, China, and broader trends of democratic erosion in different parts of the world. Hello, Sanjay.
Hi, Les. Thanks for having me.
Shauna Sylvester is the executive director of the Morris J. Wask Center for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. Shauna is a longtime leader in promoting civic engagement at all levels of our democracy. Welcome, Shauna.
Thanks so much, Les. Great to be here from BC.
Seher Shafiq, a writer and consultant, works on civic engagement, particularly among new arrivals in Canada. She is currently working to promote active citizenship at North York Community House, a settlement and integration support agency in Toronto. Welcome, Seher.
Thanks, I'm so happy to be here.
And thanks to you all for being here. I really appreciate it. Stephanie, let's start with you. When you see what's been going on the last few months with these protests that I mentioned earlier, often rallying against COVID-19 measures and vaccination, but they seem to bring in all kinds of different movements and different points of view. Is there a trend there that should worry us from a national security point of view?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a little odd to talk about national security and then on a democracy panel. That's my background, looking at threats. And, you know, traditionally, we've always tried to separate the kind of national security and democracy stuff for obvious reasons in a Western democracy. But recently with events like well before January 6th, we have started to see a lot more cooperation between national security institutions and some of the democratic institutions. For example, the CSC is now working hand in hand with Elections Canada to protect our elections from foreign influence because of the nature of these threats that, you know, we're going to talk about today. But I do want to start off by saying this isn't a natural fit, and it's not something that I necessarily welcome. It just seems to be the trend that that's happening. So as you said, like with regards to a trend, yeah, I mean, we've seen for a number of years now, actually, our national security institutions are backing away from kind of what we, describe as Al-Qaeda or Islamic State inspired extremism to now what they call ideologically motivated violent extremism as the number one public safety threat or violent extremist threat to Canada. And it's kind of hard to describe these movements. They don't have a clear ideology. I mean, I've seen them described as a soup where you have kind of various groups come together, form a bubble, and then that bubble bursts because of infighting or whatever, arrests, and then it kind of falls back in and then reforms over time. And a lot of these grievances and conspiracy theories shared with these groups are overlapping, right? And so this has kind of been a challenge because it's not always obvious as to who should be monitoring these threats, as well as who should be in charge. So, for example, CSIS is responsible for national security. The RCMP is kind of responsible for federal and prosecuting these different groups when they resort to violence. But on the other hand, these are extremist movements, but not everyone in them is violent, even though they can have harmful effects on our democracy. So then, do we bring in institutions like Heritage Canada, perhaps the less pointy sections of Public Safety Canada? It's a very hard thing to do. But I think what is so concerning right now is the fact that you have the merging of kind of some of these ideological, I'll use the term IMVE just for short, IMVE groups that have existed well before COVID, but they're latching on to the very tangible groups that we're seeing in terms of the anti-vax, anti-mask, right? Whereas before, a lot of these groups are kind of talking about like UN conspiracy theories and like there's a global compact on migration. No one really cares about that. But a lot more people care about the fact they have to wear a mask, that they're in a lockdown, that all these different things is really part of the concern. So and it opens up this opportunity for these groups to kind of come down with these kind of anti-vax Facebook groups, social media groups, now in-person protests, and actually make inroads with these groups. So this is the movement that we're seeing. And it's not like they're framing these as policy challenges. Unfortunately, they're not going to write, or maybe fortunately, they're not going to write their views in policy options, right? They're framing these issues as life and death. It's either our way or it's just pure tyranny from some kind of globalist cabal of, pick your anti-Semitic, Islamophobic conspiracy theory. And then, so it's not surprising to me that not everyone, but some people within these groups are then motivated to engage in violence because they're not engaging in politics. They're kind of creating what I would call an anti-politics. Right? It's like, you're not trying to solve problems with different solutions. You no longer believe in the viability of the political institution to solve your problems. You feel like it's corrupt, right? There's a corrupt elite. It has to be destroyed. And therefore, this is the kind of approach. So when we see increased violence and threats against these institutions, we shouldn't really be that surprised. I mean, that was a lot just to throw out there. I don't know if you want me to continue on. I'll stop there. And then
one thing I'll just throw out there to illustrate the range of what you're talking about. When I was a reporter on the prairies 20 years ago, I covered the very lonely trial of a tax evasion trial of a person who described himself as a free man on the land. If I understand what you're saying correctly, a person like that who used to be by himself fighting in court on an issue like that now is being sort of swept into these movements.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of interaction. So, for example, the sovereign citizen movement, which is like the freemen of the land movement, right? A lot of similarity between those two movements. They have really bought into a lot of the anti-public health measures, the anti-COVID, they're anti-vax, all these things. We've seen someone declare themselves the Queen of Canada, Queen of Republic of Canada, actually. They can work that out, how that works. But, and using that kind of pseudo-legal language up on storefronts to challenge different public health mandates and things like this. And, for a long time, we used to talk, I used to work on violent extremism in the national security space, but it was well known that the number one cause of deaths of first responders in the United States was the sovereign citizen movement, right? But we never recognized that as a violent extremist threat until fairly recently. And but yeah, no, these are violent groups. These people can act violently, and when they find like-minded people either online or in person, it just kind of really amplifies the situation we're dealing with.
Shauna, you have a lot of experience talking to people with vastly different views and working to break through the type of polarization we're seeing. What do you hear and see from the West Coast that has changed in recent years from what you see?
Well, one thing I want to do is I want to put what Stephanie's talking about with it, which might be race-based extreme violence, to one point. And I want to look at protests in a bit of a different context, because there are many people, certainly in British Columbia, that are attracted to protest. And there are a small number of people, a very small number of people, attracted to the anti-vax movement and the anti-mask movement. It's not a big movement. We're at, what, 85% vaccination, I think, close to that in British Columbia. So it's very small. And within that subset, there are groups, there might be individuals that take violent tendencies. There might be individuals that see violence as a way forward, but the vast majority do not. And so I think this is what's really important, because at the Center for Dialogue, we spend a lot of time thinking about how we other and how we polarize. And we want to stay as curious and as compassionate and as understanding as we can within the limits. We believe strongly in freedom of expression. I know when I look at the anti-vax movement in British Columbia, I see friends of friends there. I see kids of very close friends there. When I went to Nelson, there's a whole community in Nelson that are anti-vaxxers, anti-mask. And the reason they would see themselves not as alt-right, they'd actually see themselves as very progressive. They would argue, and they come out of traditional medicines or Chinese medicine or healthcare. They'd say that, you know, really what's at the root of the problem is the healthcare system that's disease-focused, that's corporate-driven, that's too far into the hands of pharmacy. Whether I agree with them or not, that's their perspective. And so they're coming to this movement asking for something from our society that's broader than the conversation that we're having. And that's where I think we have to be really clear and stay curious with people we disagree with, to really understand where are they coming from, and to really understand, is there a way to engage in that conversation? Is there a way to understand their worldview? And then to discuss and to see if there's a way that we can come to some kind of different understanding. And that's, to me, the role of dialogue and the importance of dialogue in these kinds of conversations. I want to characterize, though, there is a line that I draw there as well. When people start to use violence, or they see violence as a legitimate means to addressing a conflict, that needs to be addressed immediately. We're not talking about freedom of expression. When people start inciting violence against doctors or nurses, or harassing, or politicians, that needs to be, and that's where I believe the legal community has a role to step in. And then I would say to the media community, we don't glorify in any way, we don't amplify their influence. We show them for who they are, the small numbers that they are, so that we're not creating and amplifying their movement. So that's what I think is a really important part of this conversation. How do we depolarize? How do we engage? How do we understand? And then how do we deal with the fringes that are using violence as a means to their ends?
You're probably well aware, Shauna, and I certainly am with my history as a journalist, that the line between exposing and trying to create dialogue and amplification is something we struggle with every time we write about any of these things. And I'm just wondering if you have any more specific tips to my journalist friends who might be dialing into this to just watch me sweat in front of a camera.
Well, I think, Les, we all know that, you know, what bleeds leads. We like to be attracted to the drama of the extremes. And we tend to give a profile and characterization of those extremes without unpacking them. And I spent half my time in the US. I was in the US through most of the lead up to the last election. It was palpable. We were not engaging. I think a lot of people join movements. The number of people I've been talking to who have engaged with the anti-vax movement is they're coming out of a pandemic isolated. They want belonging, they want community. And they're finding that in some of these movements. There might be some aspect of what they like. They like the person, they like their passion, they like the politics of what they're saying. And so they're attracted to them. And I think we can't ever forget that one of the things that Trump did very effectively, in a way I might find very offensive, but he went into communities and say, you matter. Certain communities matter. You matter. You matter, and your voice matters. And, you small town person over there who doesn't want to, anybody that tells you differently is a woke cappuccino sipping lefty. And, but you matter. And so the belonging that got created, we got to be careful of not alienating those folks.
So Sahar, I'll shift to you. And when Shauna mentions communities that feel alienated, you work a lot with communities and you work hard to try and engage them in civic processes and in the democratic process and in voting and in just getting them engaged in their society. When the communities you deal with see what's going on, and I suspect they don't necessarily see all the distinctions that Shauna would like us all to see a bit more with, as far as understanding that there's different motivations for different people. What effect does this have on the people you deal with as you try to promote civic engagement?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for that question. It's been really interesting doing this work during the pandemic. And I'm so happy to be here. I've been honestly looking forward to this conversation with all of you all week. So I think first I'll talk about what I do and some of the research that we've learned along the way, and then I'll connect it to what some of my colleagues here are saying. So I work at a local nonprofit organization in Toronto called North York Community House, and I run a national project that is designing civic engagement curriculum for agencies that serve immigrants and refugees. So as part of this work, we've done an extensive literature review on the topic of newcomer civic engagement, and as much as possible, tried to focus on the Canadian perspective. So what we found is very interesting considering the climate that we're in. We find that newcomers' trust in fellow Canadians has a non-linear relationship with the time spent in Canada. So when newcomers come to Canada, they have low levels of trust. And then the longer that they're here, it increases based on, alleviating settlement challenges and getting integrated. But the longer they're here to experience discrimination, trust actually plateaus or goes down. And trust in your community and institutions is a direct indicator of your capacity to engage civically. So we can see how all of the things happening today are impacting huge communities' ability to develop civic capacity and to engage in their communities. So, I could talk about the academic research forever. It says similar things. But even anecdotally, as part of my job, I've had to do a lot of group sessions with immigrants and refugees and one-on-one interviews. And as we design these sessions, we have questions about voting and civic engagement. What are you involved in? And it's so interesting because in almost every single group session or interview that we did, the experiences of racism and discrimination came through as such a strong theme, even though we didn't ask about it. So when we're talking to people about civic engagement, even if we're not asking about race-based issues and discrimination, they're telling us that is a huge barrier for me. I went to a school meeting and had a experience where someone thought I couldn't speak English and I had a bad experience. I'm not going to go back there again. Why would I go do something that was a negative experience? So you can see how in the climate of everything that's happening, it's disenfranchising so many people and further marginalizing communities that are already at the fringes, only further contributing to polarization. And then you add isolation and all the other things we're going to talk about today, and you can see how things get really, really messy and very polarizing.
I definitely want to return to that theme of isolation in a little bit. But first, Sanjay, as you well know, Policy Options has been running a multi-part series on how to improve elections with the support from the Samara Center for Democracy. You made a major contribution to it with, I think, 2 or perhaps 3 pieces, and thank you for that.
One so far.
Oh yeah, the other one's coming soon. We can talk about that later. You studied the health of democracies. You lived in one under duress in the United States for quite a long time before you returned to Canada. What are the warning signs from other countries that you think we in Canada should be thinking about?
That's a big question. I mean, one of the things that's very striking is over the last 10, 15 years, a lot of political scientists who've been studying this have a term. It's basic idea of erosion of democracy, democratic backsliding. So you see an erosion or a deterioration in the norms, the institutions, the practices that we associate with good democratic governance. And I think, there are a number of different attributes or dimensions of this phenomenon. You see growing restrictions on civil liberties and political rights, particularly of minority groups and women. You see a growing concentration of power by the executive, vis-a-vis legislatures, parliaments in particular, but also judiciary is it's obviously a very controversial and complex question, how much power should a judiciary have vis-a-vis the parliament and legislatures. But you see the sort of concentration of power. You see, as everyone's spoken about already, really insightfully, growing social polarization and different axes of that. Racial and ethnic is obviously very prominent, but you also see ones, we call it sectoral or geographic, urban-rural divides, very striking. You see them in the United States, you see them in Britain during Brexit, you see it with the rise of the far right in France and Germany. That divide between the big cosmopolitan cities and the so-called hinterlands of various countries, that's a big divide. That's sort of a third. You see populism of left and right, sort of a distrust of institutions and representatives, intermediaries, distrust of experts. You see a left and right-wing version of that, but it's the one and I'm not saying that the left-wing version doesn't have problems, but the one that we see, I would say this, as there's a certain kind of toxicity about the right-wing version because it leads itself to a nationalism, which is not based on civic identity, but a ethno-national identity. There's some idea of we the people, and that people is a very restricted, ethnocentric definition. So, those are just some of the attributes you see. And I think the other one, I started with that, I think it's very important to understand is what's striking about the erosion. And I have to put this in a larger historical context. If we live in Canada or you're in the West for a long time, and you're concerned about the state of democracy, often it was about, well, what does democracy look like and what are its prospects in other parts of the world? I've spent 30 years working on India, which is the most surprising democracy in many ways historically. But typically you take India as exceptional in this larger historical record. Most of the time you look at Latin America and Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, the conventional narrative was, we have established democracies. It's the only game in town. They're here to stay. And it's in those other parts of the world that we see coups, and it's a classic case of a democratic breakdown, or you see party systems that don't work, you see mass corruption and so on. What's very striking about the last 20 years is that a lot of the things we saw in other parts of the world are happening here. And we saw it obviously in the United States, you see it in parts of Western Europe. And I think one of the things that's very striking is it's that erosion of norms, of procedures, of conventions, of sort of red lines, so to speak. That when we say the phrase, this could never happen here, it's usually about somebody behaving or conducting themselves a certain way. Somebody wouldn't say that, or somebody wouldn't do that. And that's exactly how that erosion happens. The sort of mutual tolerance that is really important, the self-restraint that's really important for democratic politics to work so that it doesn't become a winner-take-all game, where you, as Sean was saying, demonize your opponents, your rivals. That's really crucial. And I think I sort of end with that is if you think about something like, say, what happened in the United States with the rise of Trump, I think as political scientists, social scientists, you can explain it, right? From like big structural factors to small things like, Hillary Clinton didn't go enough to Wisconsin and campaign for the vote. And we can explain it really well. But why did it shock so many people? Well, it shocked so many people because he was openly, explicitly, almost with sort of zeal, violating norms that we thought you couldn't violate and get elected. And I think that's the crucial thing to understand, that that's how that erosion takes place, that we start to say that these norms don't matter as much. And then all bets are off in some way, because it's a demonstration effect, and people feel emboldened across borders by seeing somebody act a certain way and say, well, if they can do it, so can I.
Stephanie, if I could return to you for a second. Sanjay's last comment reminds me of how I've talked to you before when we've had incidents that have happened, you know, murders, hate-based crimes. And often when we cover those things, and when I've covered those things, I hear a lot from people saying that I'm drawing, that we shouldn't be drawing links between this certain kind of speech and this sort of activism, often that break those norms that Sanjay is talking about, because you know, just because someone's writing hate speech on a website doesn't mean that they will be moved to murder, or that they will move someone to murder. When people try to either divide or join those things together as a cause and effect, are we out to lunch, or is that does it all go hand in hand to a certain extent?
I think it does. I mean, obviously, the people who do end up mobilizing to violence are people who are inspired by something and have had their beliefs confirmed, often by other people. I mean, we always talk in. It's very seldom that you have someone who just watches a lot of YouTube videos and then goes out and commits a violent extremist act, right? That's not. It happened. It has happened. But I'm not saying it's impossible, but the vast majority of violent extremists are people who've met up with other people. Violent extremism is a social phenomenon, right? And so I think what we're looking at is kind of a level of permissibility. And I want to bear in mind very much what Shauna said, and like with regards to like how we talk to these people, how we engage, and they're not, I mean, I think I've done like 12 interviews this week or last week where I had to say, no, not everyone in the PPC are Nazis, but there are Nazis in the PPC. Like, I mean, so we have to, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to call it the PPC because that's where we are. We have actually seen, you know, there's violent extremist groups that are absolutely targeting some of these anti-vax public health movements that are targeting the PPC. We have seen messages in Discord forums where the Canada First movement in particular is targeting, if people have heard of them, they're the Groypers. It's a terrible rabbit hole. If you want to go down that particular one, we can talk about that later if you want. But they're saying, look, this is how we get our white nationalist Canada. By voting in this way. So, I mean, there are people who are trying to do this through elections and things like this, and the question then becomes, okay, well, what happens for those who don't believe that? So the challenge, I think, for national security is that we tend, believe it or not, you don't tend to monitor entire movements. You don't tend to monitor entire institutions or groups or parties. You're just looking for those violent elements within them. But it's so hard to look for the individuals who are mobilizing and who aren't. And this is a real challenge that we've had. I mean, look, the January 6th movement, I mean, most of us who follow this stuff knew that something bad was going to happen on January 6th, right? It was never going to be great. It was far worse than I had thought. But I mean, the open source intelligence was there, but we're bad at recognizing these kinds of threats, you know, whether it's structural biases within national security organizations, or because we're still not sure how to deal with these, again, what I called anti-political movements. We just didn't catch it. So, I mean, there's a lot to your question, Les, but basically, I think that, you know, I'll just end on this note, is like in the conversations I've had with, you know, the people who are responsible for protecting our parliamentary buildings and the politicians in them, is that, you know, for a long time, they've always believed that, okay, they have to protect the buildings from terrorist threats, from crime, from espionage, you know, people sneaking in and espionage risks and things like this. And now they're facing, like, what do we do when we're faced with a mob of people armed with hockey sticks, right? And fire extinguishers and other kind of bric-a-brac that they're trying to use in order to kind of make a point or to basically argue that they're now in charge, or to intimidate their political opponents, right? This is the entire security posture of these buildings has had to change. And my concern is, but I would defer to the other experts on this panel, is that when this kind, and again, I perhaps reflecting my concern about how national security actually fits in these conversations, is when we overprotect these buildings, it becomes harder for Canadians to participate in their democracy, right? And does that actually worsen the problem? Does that actually, we're trying to protect these institutions, but do we protect them to the extent that suddenly people can't access their politicians, they can't access their institutions? And does that just feed into some of the problems we're actually talking about?
Maybe Shauna and then Sahara, I'll turn to you. We talked, you've mentioned, I think both of you have mentioned how the role that isolation has played in all of this, the 1.5 year long pandemic. I'm curious, given what Stephanie just said, we have all these silos sort of being built, and we're becoming isolated from our democratic institutions for security reasons. We're becoming isolated from each other because of the pandemic. What has this done to the health of our democracy? The fact that we can't meet, have town halls, there've been a few on the election recently, I guess, and it's provoked a backlash too. But I'm just curious what this is doing to us all as far as democratic actors.
So I want to draw on something Sahir and Sanjay said before I get to that, if that's okay, because
That's
I think
all right,
there's a really important point here, and this didn't come out of nowhere. This has been a process. Sahara's been talking about the erosion of trust and how, I just think that research is fascinating, that the longer an immigrant or refugee is in Canada, their trust either plateaus or dies. And I think that this whole issue of what was okay 20 years ago and those norms is now permissible. So I think we have to look, like, I keep going back to that time in 2010 when Karl Rove was providing advice to the Conservative Party about, okay, it's about, you got to wedge issues. You've got to really change the way in which you run for office. It's talk to your base, suppress voting, particularly suppress voting where in demographic communities you might vote in a different way that's not conservative. The way in which he took what was a conservative movement that I think almost any Canadian could recognize, and over time, the rules of engagement changed, and so the rules of engagement for all parties changed. Wedges used to became a thing. You don't talk about real policy; you actually get at talking to your base. I mean, it became a really different kind of environment for elections and political parties. And what I've seen and what we've been looking at the center is just how much our political parties have stopped engaging with citizens, how much our elected officials, it might be a check off, it might appear in every mandate letter, but the authentic engagement that happens with citizens doesn't happen in a way that strengthens those democratic institutions and norms. So to go to the issue of isolation, I actually think the pandemic has done a couple of things. One, I think it's deepened democratic engagement for some of us. It's much more accessible. I'm more equal on a Zoom. I can access, it's cheaper. There's a whole bunch of ways that I can engage that I could never engage before. The depth of things, the, buy nothing networks, the things that have happened around social media that have provided an equitable. Then for some, it has deepened that isolation. Because if you were isolated and you didn't have access to social media, or it wasn't the way you communicated, and you didn't have a connectivity to the internet, or you didn't have a capacity to figure out how to use this computer, as my parents did not, the isolation grew further and further. And so one of the stories I heard that was heartbreaking on Friday night is a friend of mine said, one of my closest friends has become part of the anti-vax movement. She has been a single mom by herself on a farm through COVID. And she's had herself and her child. And she's got all sorts of questions. And I'm not sure what she's reading or what she's watching. But all of a sudden, there was somebody that reached out to her in a human relationship-based way. And that became a way for her to get involved in her community. They accepted her and they found ways of communicating to her reality, and she got involved. Someone nobody would have ever expected to get involved. So we really have to look at that issue of how are we carrying out our democracy? Is it becoming sports teams talking to each other and putting their elbows out and say, this is the way we conduct ourselves? Or are we actually really engaging and caring about what citizens, in particular, what Ms. Sahar is talking about, people who have come here, who've chosen this country, who have come here, are we engaging in a way that actually listens to their voices? Are we reflecting those communities and who we are in our representative governments? And those, to me, are fundamental questions. And so the extremism didn't just come. I think that there has been a slow progression that we have to take care of. We have to think about it.
So Hera, do you want to add anything on this issue of isolation and how wedges reinforce those silos that we're all in?
Yeah, I mean, isolation and everything that we've experienced over the past year and a half is exactly what is the opposite of what fosters civic engagement. We've all been through a prolonged period of isolation, frustration, for some of us purposelessness, and there are decades and decades of research to show that these are the conditions that make people pull away from communities, pull away from the collective, and helps to breed radicalization and extreme views. And it's happening on both sides. There's the rise in the alt-right and white supremacist movements. Stephanie talked about the soup that's in these protests that we're seeing, and some of them are violent, or they could become violent. I mean, we saw it a few months ago with the murder of that Muslim family in London, and you have to think what happened in that person's journey before that moment. And I think that there's a lot of similar journeys happening right now, and we can sort of see the seeds of it, and maybe it's not violent yet, but it's definitely there. The other point I want to make really quickly is the concept of time is really weird during the pandemic, and it's hard to believe that it's been about a year since the BLM, Black Lives Matter movement, and everything that came with it. That was a huge part of the pandemic. That was a huge part of how many of us look at systems that work or don't work for us. And I think there's this change, and especially in people of color for sure, and others as well, there's a heightened awareness of how there's a disconnect between the systems and the people with whom they're supposed to work for. So, I look at the protests of the ones with the Prime Minister and the gravel throwing, and I think about the way that we police certain communities over others. I mean, can you imagine if that group of people throwing rocks at the Prime Minister was any other demographic? Can you imagine if that was a group of Black people or a group of people that are visibly Muslim? What would the headlines be? The headlines would absolutely not be, like fringe groups are throwing gravel at a prime minister. And, I don't have to explain that further. But anyways, the point of all of this is that it's happening on both sides, this marginalization, isolation, polarization. And I know you probably have a question of where do we go from here? But there are things that we can do about it. But yeah, those are the 2 points that I wanted to make.
Stephanie, I think you wanted to add something.
Yes, yeah, I just wanted, just to amplify the point. One of the things that, I agree with like literally everything you're saying, Sarah. That's fundamentally true on both points. And Shauna, you speak to this too with the isolation. One of the things that has been found, Lauren Dawson at the University of Waterloo, he actually started his research on violent extremism looking at cults, but found similarities with violent extremist movements. Is these are actually not evil people to start off with. In a lot of cases, these are people who actually are motivated. They want to do something in the world. They start off by wanting to help. I'm not saying that's where they end up by any means. And I'm not saying that's always the case with everyone on the far right, for sure. But in a lot of cases, these are people who are motivated by not just grievances, but also wanting to do something. And they kind of go down the wrong hole very quickly. Like they're upset about poverty and suddenly they start blaming immigrants, or they're upset about healthcare and like, well, why are all these people taking up the system? Things like this. And so it's, to be clear, I don't agree with any of those points. I'm not sympathetic to them. But these are people who are often motivated to wanting to do something to better a community and end up just going down a very, very bad path. But these extremist movements, these anti-vax movements, cults, things like that, they offer, as Sean has said, that hand, that outreach, that solution that these people are looking for. And I don't know, maybe, and I'm definitely not an expert in any of this front, but if maybe our society was better at finding opportunities for people to make a difference in their community or feel like they're useful, or that might actually help. And certainly there are people who work in the countering violent extremist space who are arguing just that. Like, we need to actually provide better channels for people to go into society and actually work. And I'll stop talking because I'm definitely out of my league.
Sanjay, I have a question for you. When you look at all of this, I wonder what role you think populist politicians play in it.
Well, they play an incredibly important role. They fan this resentment, this sense of grievance, and often use tropes that we associate with democracy, but in a way that they sort of distort or pervert some of its meaning. You think of the rhetoric around freedom, during the pandemic. Now, it's true, civil liberties have been restricted in sort of autocratic regimes, and in some, and mostly in autocratic regimes, they've been restricted in a draconian way. So you see the protests that are erupting in many parts of the world as really sort of democratic protests that, this is heavy-handed state response. But when you think about, and there are genuine dilemmas. I mean, we have a balance to trade off between civil liberties and public safety. You have freedom of expression and movement and assembly, but you also have the right to life. And public health experts and doctors, of course, have a commitment to the precautionary principle, to be prudent. And we only have to see what's happening in Alberta right now when you're not prudent, right? I mean, it's infuriating to see something like that happen because it was so predictable. If you encourage a distrust, which is already there because of atomization or the erosion of institutions over a long period of time, and say we shouldn't be trusting people who have spent their lives trying to understand public health or how our states work and how to organize a public response, then those politicians are responsible, and of course all those who have bet around them as well. So I think that is really important. And I think the only thing I'd say is, so again, it's been coming up in comments from everybody now, that sense of isolation, of atomization, of disaffection, what it requires is much more empowerment at multiple levels, right? So it starts with our citizens. How often do they, and you see these trends over time, the number of people who are members of parties or associations and so on, it's declining over time. And that sense of connectedness is fraying. But even within our formal public institutions, and that's why I sort of started with the idea of concentration of power. Samara, for instance, has been doing these reports for quite some time. They do an exit interviews with MPs when they leave our parliament. And how empowered do they feel in parliament? Well, they don't, right? They're supposed to represent the constituents that vote them into power. But the party whip is so strong. The Prime Minister's office is so strong. We just have the most recent evidence of this. Claims being said that advisors in the Prime Minister's office are more powerful than cabinet ministers who are elected in a government that's based on collegial responsibility. I mean, that's kind of an astonishing claim, and a reality from, again, most people who've worked in this system. So I think that's where we're getting towards the idea, like what you might do to address this. And you begin by addressing it by trying to devolve power, by trying to engage citizens. And there are multiple sort of innovations and experiments that are taking place in different parts of the world we could learn from.
So we have a few questions from our viewers and listeners here. I haven't pre-read any of them, so I'm not sure who they will go to, but we'll figure it out as we go. So one of our viewers asks, federal leaders in Canada have mostly avoided talking about Quebec's recent legislative agenda, referring to Bill 21 and Bill 96. It has been argued by many groups representing minorities, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, and linguistic minorities that these laws are discriminatory. Do you consider Quebec's liberal use of Section 33 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms dangerous? Has the lack, maybe we could boil it down to, has the lack of Canada's response to Quebec's bills contributed to democratic backsliding in Canada? Go ahead, Stephanie. Brave person.
Yeah, I'll go into the snake pit. This sounds fun. My concern about this is that the law itself is clothed in neutrality, whereas it explicitly targets the Muslim community, specifically hijab-wearing Muslim women. I don't think that is disputable. That's certainly the impact of the law, and it's I would argue the intention of the law as well. And yeah, you can all hate me. I'm from Oshawa. That's fine. But I think at the end of the day that my concern from this perspective is that it does feed into narratives that, you know, maybe the Quebec government is saying, no, we don't support these narratives, we don't support this. But I mean, you are basically saying that, you know, when people are themselves, when they are, you know, wearing something as part of their religious faith, whether a kippah, whether a hijab or whatever, a turban, they're not one of us. They are others, right? And they are hurting our society because we are a secular society. And I think that does feed into narratives which move us closer to a lot of the things that a lot of these violent extremists like. And again, I understand the secularism, I understand the principles and things like that, but to me, this is just my concern from a national security perspective, is that it really does contribute to this environment where predominantly new Canadians are othered for just being themselves. And it's unfortunate. And I'm glad the question was asked in the debate, frankly.
Does anyone else want to add? Sanjay?
Yeah, I just want to jump in. Stephanie mentioned, you know, secularism. I think it's really important to see that there are different models of secularism. Quebec and France, you know, at a larger scale, believe in laicité. That's one model of secularism, freedom from religion. The American model is freedom to religion, which is quite different. And then, you know, there's a third model that lots of scholars talk about. For instance, India used to exemplify it before this current Hindu nationalist politics has taken over, which is freedom among religions. And I think that's the question to ask, is what form of secularism is going to expand democratic inclusion? And, you know, if a model of secularism is going to disenfranchise lots of people and effectively make them second-class citizens in important realms of public life, and then into private life, our private sphere, and that's something that we have to reconsider. You know, and I think that's a larger issue that we talk about. Our institutions and principles may have been formulated some time ago, and the question is, that's where the innovation and reform and change has to come into play. You know, are they suitable to the times? We talk about it in our economies, right? We talk about our welfare systems. Are they fit to purpose? Well, are our democratic institutions and some of the principles we use to organize public life, you know, suitable for the world we live in now in 2021 going ahead?
Does anyone else want to add something, or can we move on to the next question?
I would only quickly add to remind us all that in 2018, Doug Ford used Section 33 to cut council in half, Toronto City Council. And to use that in a situation like that, to me, is an indication of how politicians are going in this direction of doing things without having the support, like popular support. And to me, that's very connected to the erosion of democracy.
Charles Ungerleider. Charles, I apologize if I mispronounced your last name, a professor emeritus at UBC. To what extent are conspiracy theories consciously used to destabilize existing public institutions as opposed to expressing anger about the loss of privilege or the perception that privilege has been lost? So are they tools of destabilization or merely expressions of loss of privilege, or both?
It's great to
like
see.
maybe
I saw
both to me.
Charles's name in the Q&A. Hello, Charles. Great to see your name up. So I think that this is speaking to intention, and to what extent are they being used, and to what extent are they being used by local forces and international forces? And to what extent is the structure of the social media taking us to further and further extremes that enable the conspiracy theories to get more and more extreme? I think it comes down to the issue of intention. I don't think there's a simple answer in response to what Charles is asking. But I do think that they're destabilizing, absolutely. I think that there are forces at play that are intentionally trying to destabilize our democracy, destabilize our electoral processes, destabilize the way in which we approach our communities. And I'll use an example from 2019. There was a mayoral race in Coquitlam, and I sat down with the mayor of Coquitlam or Port Moody, and he sat down and he said, it was unreal watching the international attention, email addresses, text, social media coming from outside of Canada into our very, very tiny communities' electoral processes. There was a reason why there was a lot of focus on that, not necessarily in this election, but the last election there was. These are forces and they are destabilizing. And I think we need to be aware of them, but I also don't think we need to see everything through those forces. I don't think every person that's on an email spewing a conspiracy theory. I know that there's a lot of young people who kind of like doing that to see who'll pick it up. It's kind of a performance comedy thing going on. So I don't want to see everything in those terms, but yes.
So if I could just add to that and kind of amplify a lot what was being said there. What I would say is there was actually a really interesting study. It's actually back in 2010, which seems like such a gentler time in retrospect, but it was done by Jamie Bartlett. And it's called The Power of Unreason. And what it did is it surveyed known extremist groups at the time or violent extremist groups, terrorist movements. And it said that not every conspiracy theory is supported by a terrorist group, but every terrorist group believes in at least one conspiracy theory as a core part of its doctrine. So just to underscore the point, these are absolutely destabilizing phenomenon that do help extremist groups.
Salam Abraham asks, in terms of the Capitol riots and its efforts to stop the verification of Biden's election, should we interpret the situation as proof of democracy's fragility because the rioters were so close to overturning the election? Is there something democracies can do better to prevent such a situation? I suppose in the end, Joe Biden did become president. So do we have a sign of a robust democracy or a democracy under threat, I guess? I'm not sure who to start with that one. Perhaps Sanjay?
Well, I think it was definitely a democracy under threat. I mean, they stormed the Capitol. I think it's certain institutions, didn't fail, and two were critical. Of course, one was the judiciary, the various courts, and the Supreme Court, which, despite multiple allegations that there was rigging in that election, didn't see the time of day in court.
And that wasn't a given, was it?
That was not a given, given how politicized the American judiciary has become, and how I think the second one that's really crucial, and this is where we talk about levels of democracy, right? That as everyone knows, very infamously, that Donald Trump tried to browbeat Republican legislators or members of the party in key states to do his bidding, and they resisted. And so I think that gets to the larger issue of, we talk about populism at the start. It's really important that institutions have their independence and their autonomy and their integrity, and that people who have roles in those institutions fulfill their mandate. And I think that, so in that instance, two key institutions held up, but it was absolutely an assault on a democracy, and it showed it far more fragile than we thought. I mean, you just do a simple what if counterfactual, just go back and ask that question to yourself or on a survey 5-10 years ago. Can you imagine an assault on the Capitol to try to subvert an electoral result? And most people would say, no, you couldn't. But here we are. And similar things happening in lots of places around the world.
There's one last audience point I'd like to get to. And Darlene Johnson writes, she would like to hear some of you about how we can engage Indigenous peoples in our democracy. I think that raises a good point that there are some people who legitimately don't believe our system represents them, and that the entire exercise has been imposed to basically dominate them. So that's sort of a different flip side of the coin, where to some extent our democracy needs to be overhauled in a different way too, not just as far as engaging disgruntled people, but people who have never been engaged in the system. I think maybe Shauna, you might have some thoughts about this.
Sure, and I taught a course where we spent a fair bit of time looking at this issue and seeing, I live in a province where Indigenous people never signed treaties. At no point did they cede their land. And so the colonial administration that is on this province that governs them is very deeply colonial and seen in very oppressive terms. One of the things that we're doing at the Center for Dialogue is looking at creating a house of dialogue where it's Indigenous to Indigenous. So can you imagine if nation to nation had the opportunity to really build their capacity around governance? I mean, how would this relationship to the colonial structures that they deal with, how would that change? And what would governance look like? I think that there's deep learnings about democracy with Indigenous communities, and there's non-democratic notions as well. But there are fundamental, and I've certainly learned from them, sitting in an Indigenous circle where people have a chance to really state their views, provide ideas, listening. I mean, one of the greatest parts of dialogue, which I see as pivotal to democracy, is the capacity to listen, to not form judgments, to listen deeply before we act. And that is something that I think if we look at Indigenous philosophies, we're going to gain greater insights on how to actually make our institutions more democratic. But I think that we have a big issue here. That Indian Act is probably one of the most colonial instruments that we have, and it has to go. And that's not going to change as long as we continue to just give lip service to reconciliation and decolonization. We have to begin to transform our decision-making processes and not isolate and tokenize the few Indigenous people that do get into political power.
So we're running out of time, and I'd really be remiss if I didn't give you each one last chance to tell us what are the solutions to these threats to our democracy. You each have 25 seconds. No, I'm kidding. You have a little bit more than that, but please give me your one or two your best ideas for how we preserve our democracy in the face of what we see.
Well, I started, so I'll start by saying the best part about being a national security analyst is that we didn't have to solve anything. We just always used to say how bad things are. I might just do that. I don't think national security is not going to solve this, right? That's one thing I can tell you, right? It's at the end of the day, it's going to be some kind of political engagement. I don't know what that's going to look at. The only thing national security is good at is hopefully stopping violent extremists, and that's what it should be limited to. It should not be engaging in the space as to what makes a good democracy. It should just be looking to protect those institutions which are trying to figure those out. So that's my cop out. You're welcome.
Sahara, maybe we'll go next because we haven't heard from you in a few minutes.
Sure. I would say there are significant policy implications in the long term, especially for the isolation, frustration, and anger that we've all experienced over the last year and a half. And I think government should fund programs that get people to meaningfully engage with those that they don't agree with, and also fund programs in grassroots community to help build and strengthen the civic life in those communities and engage with people who feel like they don't belong. The negative piece about all of this is usually these types of programs, the impact of them is very long term. And so it's a situation where an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, but you don't have the political will to take action right now because the impact is far beyond the scope of any government that is in power right now. So something I'm thinking about.
Thank you. Shauna, how about you? What
Very quickly, more
this?
citizens assemblies. Let's treat citizens as smart people. Let's enable them to inform in deliberative processes that are very informed places. Local government is closest to the people. We do not look at our local governments. We don't look at how to support cities. We download so much to them and do not support them in doing that. They need to become an official third level of government with the adequate taxation and support to do the work that they need to do at the front lines. We need to create a civic common strategy in our country. Our civic assets are absolutely critical to the building. The closer somebody is to their community, the more likely they're going to get involved in their democracy, the more active and trust building those activities will be. We have to go back if we want to get to real democratic reform, start from the bottom, build up, at the same time that we're paying attention to the institutions so that they reflect the diversity of the communities that we are.
And Sanjay, the last word to you.
I don't know what else to add. I mean, I would endorse really strongly what Shauna said, that there are a lot of innovations, experiments, and participatory democracy, new forms of representation, civic assemblies, deliberative forums, mini publics, participatory budgeting, which actually began in Brazil and it was imported north, so to speak. I think there's a lot of that in the world. There's a big network called Participedia, which studies these things. People are interested in that. And I think the other one we have to think about is how to improve our accountability in our systems. And one way of doing that I've discovered since coming back to Canada after 25 years away is what seems like a surprising lack of transparency in a lot of our institutions. Our Freedom of Information Act, I think, is desperate need of overhaul. It's very hard. It's a kind of not culture of secrecy, but a culture of resistance to, publicizing information that's really important to us as citizens. So I think on all three fronts, looking for innovations elsewhere and trying to learn from them that would devolve power and empower communities and citizens, I think is really crucial.
Well, I've learned a ton from you for today. Thanks a million for joining us. I want to thank our audience. I have about 5 pages of questions here that we didn't get to. We could have easily occupied another hour with some of these very smart questions. So thank you, audience members, and my apologies for not getting to more of your questions. Stephanie Carvin, Shauna Sylvester, Seher Shafiq, Sanjay Ruparelia, you've all been very generous and patient with your new host here. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Les.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.